Hello everyone, this is Sharonna from Team Voyages into the Past, 𝗓𝗏𝘀𝘆, and today we have a very well-known historian with us. But at first, let me talk about this new series that we have come up with. A Life in History is an attempt to celebrate the academic journeys of eminent scholars. Influenced by the title of Richard Evans's work on the enormously celebrated historian Eric Hobsbawm, we have introduced this new series, which we feel would be both insightful and entertaining. The first scholar who has kindly accepted our invitation to talk about his personal experiences is Richard Eaton. Dr. Eaton is a professor of history at the University of Arizona. His interest lies in the socio-cultural history of pre-modern India. Being a specialist on the evolution of Islam in South Asia, he has authored a good number of books, including Sufis of Bijapur, The Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier, and many more, the most recent one being India in the Persianate Age. Today, the professor will be talking on the topic, How I Became an Historian, and tell us how he became a historian of India and especially of Bengal. So, without further ado, I would request Professor Richard Eaton to begin his talk and tell us about his outstanding expeditions through the world of academics. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Shania, for your very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to join you today, and I really applaud your effort to make this kind of program possible. It's a great opportunity for me, as I'm sure it is. I hope it is for all of you in India. So, how did I become an historian, and especially an historian of India? I thought I would begin this by talking about two things. Really, how did I encounter India, and also how did I encounter history? The first question really takes us very, very far back. Indeed, when I was only 2 years old, I was up on an elephant in the St. Louis Zoo with my family below me, you see here, and I'm up right here next to the mahout on the elephant whose name was Miss Jim, a very famous elephant. And I am sure that this was my first real encounter with India, and it had a very deep impact on me. After all, I'm only 2 years old, and I'm looking down on this massive elephant, this huge animal. And inasmuch as the elephant is so closely identified with Indian history and Indian culture, I think that this was really the true beginning of my encounter and my love affair with India. So it begins then. And then I go to high school, and I think one of the most important things I did in high school, growing up in Michigan, was to join the debate team. And so we went all over the state of Michigan, debating other high schools. And I think the whole process of learning how to debate and form an argument and use skills of rhetoric and so forth was a very important and useful background to my subsequent work in thinking through historical problems. I went to college in Ohio, the College of Worcester. I did not specialize in history. I specialized in philosophy, although I did take certainly one very important history course from Dr. Daniel Calhoun on Western civilization, which had a deep impact on me. But I was not at that time committed to history as such. That would come later. It really came after I went to Iran, immediately after college, 1962 to 64. I spent 2 years in Tabriz, you see up here on the map, in northwestern Iran, where I was one of 44 members or volunteers of the American Peace Corps. This was the very first mission to Iran by the American Peace Corps, established by President Kennedy. And we were there to teach agriculture and English language and skills that were aimed at training young students to go out in the countryside and teach agricultural skills to those people who had received land. Because at that time, this is before the revolution in Iran, and the Shah had this land reform program. So I went to Tabriz. I went to Iran in 1962. I got off the airplane, and I was met by my own parents. Quite extraordinary. It just happened that my mother and father were medical workers. My father was a doctor in the American hospital in Mashhad, over here on the eastern side of Iran. You see here near Afghanistan. And he had actually practiced medicine as a surgeon for 10 years there. So it was amazing that I already had this association with Persia even before I went there myself. The school that I taught in was located just outside of Tabriz. We taught agricultural mechanics, animal husbandry, poultry farming, agronomy, soil chemistry, this kind of thing. I myself taught English and soil chemistry. And most importantly, this is when I began to learn Persian. This is another photograph of the school that I lived in. This is my father who actually visited me on this occasion. And on the right-hand side was my colleague, also in the Peace Corps, with me at that time. And here we are in the dining hall with the students. I'm in the center. So we lived with the students. We taught these Iranian kids, age, I don't know, 16 to 18 or so. And again, agricultural mechanics was an important thing at the school. But the most important thing here is that this was also when I first encountered India directly. I call it my second encounter with India. The first, of course, was that elephant, Miss Jim, back in the St. Louis Zoo. In 1963, the summer, we had 2 months off, free. Classes were closed. So 2 friends of mine and I decided that we would go to India. And so we had launched this very big trip, as you see on this map. We began up here in Tehran, went to Isfahan, Kerman, and then across Baluchistan to Karachi, and all throughout South Asia, you see, as far as Chennai and Kolkata, and then up the Gangetic Plain and back. This trip was very important in terms of giving me a direct acquaintance with not just India, but also I could see through the architecture and the culture, the profound influence of Persian and Iranian culture on India, as well as, of course, Islamic culture. So this is the train to Pakistan, quite literally, from Iran, actually from Zahedan on the border between Iran and Pakistan. We took this train to Quetta. Here I am with one of the 2 volunteers. This is Pat Walsh, who is now living in Boston. I'm holding the sleeping bags that we were using on the train. Here we are in Kolkata. You see me below reading the inscription on the monument to the black hole, right there down, in the center of the city. Then we went up to the Bodh Gaya, the Mahabodhi tree. We were tourists, obviously, and obviously we went to the Taj Mahal in Agra. So this was my first real direct encounter, and I think when you come from Iran and you look at the architecture of a place like the Taj Mahal, you see already the profound influence that Iran had on India. And that, of course, would ultimately become one of the themes that would inform all of my work, which is to say, how do we explain the different responses and the different relationships between Persian and Indian cultures. And architecture is only one of these means. And I think all these ideas were kind of forming and fermenting during this initial trip in the summer of 1963 with my two friends. Then my first encounter actually teaching history began immediately after I returned to America in 1964. I went to West Virginia. You see it here. This is a mountain state. And I was driving through West Virginia looking for any kind of job, and especially a teaching job. And I asked the superintendent of schools in one of the counties here whether they needed anyone to teach anything. And you see here this town of Walton. Well, they had a high school, and there was nobody teaching history there. So the superintendent of education in that county asked me if I would be willing to teach history to 11th grade and 12th grade, in other words, high school students. I said, yes, of course, why not? I can do this. So I went down to Walton, and it's way back in the hills. It's a very small town. There's only 3 buildings in this town. Here you see the countryside. This is a river that flows through Walton, the Pocatello River. And these are the kinds of roads that were in this backwoods area of West Virginia, a very beautiful part of the country, I might add. But there's only 3 important buildings, commercial buildings or business buildings, and one is the bank, one is a general store, and the third up on the hill behind this general store is the school, the Walton High School. So for 1 year, I taught history to high school students, 1964-65. And you see me here in the lower left, along with some of my colleagues who are also teaching in this high school. And here's another photograph of 5 students in the middle, and on the far left and far right are 2 of my colleagues teaching in the school. All these kids were bussed in from the countryside. They lived far away from Walton, and the yellow bus would come every morning with these students. Here's the principal, here's the secretary, here students are taking a test, very familiar scene to all of you, of course. The lunchroom was part of the high school, and so was agricultural mechanics, just like what I've encountered in Iran. These are the kinds of things that were taught in the high school. But the other important thing that happened before I left that little town of Walton, in 1965, I was asked by the local newspaper, the Times Record, published in Spencer, that was the county seat for Roane County. Well, it happened in 1965 was the 100th anniversary of the formation of this county. It was formed in 1865, immediately after the American Civil War. And to celebrate the 100 years of the history of this county, this newspaper wanted a special article on the history of the county. And since I was the only history teacher in this little town of Walton, therefore I was among the only people in the whole county who was teaching history. The newspaper approached me. They said, would you be willing to write a major, long essay on the history of our county? Well, I was an outsider. I had just come from Iran, and now I'm in this little town in West Virginia, and I took it up as a challenge. I said, yes, I'll do this. So I started to drive all over the county and to talk to people. Who was the first person who settled this part of West Virginia? Where were the first roads? What were the people like? What were the transportation routes? And this is the kind of houses that I visited. And I was trying to kind of reassemble, using oral tradition as well as written records, a connected history of this county across 100 years. And some of these houses were very old. I mean, we're dealing with a part of the country that went all the way back to the early 1800s, such as the one you see here. So my introduction to studying history was really backwards. Instead of first studying history and then learning how to write history, I did it the other way. I began by writing history, and then I became so fascinated with the process of gathering information, asking questions, looking for data, sifting through the data to see what is useful, what's not useful, how to formulate larger questions. All of this I was doing more or less on my own. Although I was teaching history, I was teaching American history to these students. So I was already having some introduction to teaching, but I never really had any formal education in how to conduct research. I simply went out and kind of made up my own techniques. I only formally began to study history immediately after that year. I went straight from Walton, West Virginia, to East Virginia in 1965 to 67. I did study history at the University of Virginia, and I studied everything. I studied history of China, history of the Soviet Union and Russia, history of ancient Greece, and of course, and history of India. And of course, it was history of India that I knew I really wanted to focus on. Why? Because I'd already been to India. I had already been exposed to many of the cities of India by traveling from Iran through Karachi to Bombay, to Hyderabad, Madras, Calcutta, and all the rest of them. Because of that prior exposure to India, I wanted to study India here at the University of Virginia. So I wrote my master's degree here in 1967, and from there I went straight to do a doctorate degree, a PhD, at the University of Wisconsin. And here also is where I began to study Persian literature and Persian writing. You see, the Persian that I knew at that time was only spoken Persian. When I was in the Peace Corps in Iran, we were not encouraged to study, academically the literature of the country. The Peace Corps wanted us to be able to speak to normal Iranians, everyday Iranians. So it was only now, some 5 or 6 years later, that I began to study Persian written language and historical chronicles, and especially Indian chronicles, dealing with the Sultanate and the Mughal empires. So this is when I began to formulate what would become some of the books that I would ultimately write. The first book that I decided to take up, you see here, was the Sufis of Bijapur, entitled Social Roles of Sufis in Medieval India. And the question that I was asking when I kind of went into this topic was, how did Sufis convert Indians to Islam? I wanted to understand how we explain why there are such large Muslim populations in some parts of South Asia, but not in others. And everybody kept telling me, all the literature said that if you want to study conversion to Islam, you need to study Sufis. So I said, okay, that is what I will do. So I chose this Sultanate of Bijapur, you see on the map here. Why? Because I found a reference to a collection of biographies of famous Sufis who lived in this Sultanate between the 1300s and the 1700s. And there was one unpublished Persian text, and it was located in Hyderabad. And I said, all right, I'm going to go to Hyderabad. I'm going to find that one text, and I'm going to read all the biographies of Sufis in this one region, in Bijapur. And I will try to understand how it was they were trying to convert Indians to Islam. So I went to Hyderabad, 1970, and Asafia State Library was the place where this manuscript was located. I went there. They sent somebody back into the dark rooms of the stacks of this library. They found that manuscript. They brought it out, and that was the beginning of my research. Working first in the Asafia State Library, and then across the River Musi, also in the 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 Museum, which has an extraordinary collection of Persian documents as well as manuscripts. So for a year, I would spend most of every day working in these two libraries, the 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 and the Asafia State Library. And here we are inside the, I think this is the Asafia State Library, where I was working. And here's Bijapur. I made several trips out to Bijapur to actually see the region itself and to make contact the people who, the 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦s, or these people who were responsible for maintaining these shrines of famous Sufis. Here, for example, you have the shrine of Shah Hashim Pir Alavi, whose photograph is on the left, and the shrine is in the middle. And in the distance, you see back here the famous Gol Gumbaz. That's the tomb of Sultan Muhammad Adil Shah. So I wanted to study these Sufis. I wanted to find out what they were doing, and there are all kinds of them. Here, for example, is a dervish in Bijapur, whose painting I discovered in the 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 Museum. And I wanted to study the kind of popular role of these shrines. You can see here many children and women, especially on Thursdays, would come, in this case, to the shrine of 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 Qadri. And I also found documents like this, these folk literature, so-called 𝘓𝘵namah. 𝘓𝘵 is the grindstone where women would grind flour or wheat or millet into flour for cooking, and while they were grinding the meal, they would recite this poetry, which is ascribed to the Chishti Sufis of Bijapur. The same thing with when they were spinning. The 𝘓𝘵namah, the spinning wheel, was used to coordinate the movement of their hands and the concentration, of course, on these meditating exercises that were supposedly written by Sufis. So this, it seemed to me, was a very interesting kind of literature which nobody had studied, and it seemed to suggest some of the ways in which Islamic ideas, Muslim ideas, were penetrating into the folk culture, the medium of women doing ordinary housework, whether it's going back to the, grinding the meal, or whether it's spinning thread for weaving purposes. It seemed to be, this could be an explanation of how Islam became domesticated, as it were, in the rural countryside. And then I also studied another shrine in Bijapur, this one of Aminuddin Allah, which is up on a hill. And there I was given this certificate of membership in the Chishti order, extraordinary document. It's called a silsila, or a chain of persons extending all the way from the Prophet Muhammad at the top, and then through many generations down to the famous saint of Gulbarga, Gisudharaz, who's named here, and then descended from him, the Saint Aminuddin Allah. Now, that's the shrine that we're talking about in Bijapur. His name is here. And then at the very bottom, you have the current 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦, Farooq Hosseini. And what's interesting is that this document allows anybody to enroll themselves in this silsila, so that you can become a member of this, and your name would appear here. It says Be'isma, or in the name of, right here, and then you fill in the date, the month, and so forth. So this document is an extraordinary kind of vehicle by which ordinary people could be integrated into the as members of this Sufi order. This was all interesting, but I did not really find all that much evidence of conversion. That for the most part, Sufis were not very much interested in the non-Muslim population in Bijapur. So I decided if I really want to study a case of mass conversion on a large scale, I have to leave the Deccan and I really need to go to Bengal, because Bengal is one of the regions of South Asia where, as we all know, there is a very substantial Muslim population. And I want to understand, why does Islam become such a vital force in eastern Bengal? So I go to Calcutta. Here we are in Swinhoe Street, where the American Institute of Indian Studies was located. I was there in 1981. I think this is the same part. I think this is the same street. I'm sure many of you people probably know better than I do with the story of now. But anyway, when I was there, the American Institute was located, I believe, at this corner. And I would travel every day by bus downtown to the writers' buildings with some of my colleagues who were then teaching in the Presidency College, and look at records dealing with Bengal. I found very little that was useful, I have to say, dealing with the pre-British period. Obviously, the writers' building is concerned mainly with colonial documents. And I realized that if I really want to study this question, I need to go to eastern Bengal, especially when it dawned on me, obviously, the majority of the Muslim population in Bengal is located in the eastern portion, the eastern half, rather than the western half. So it seemed to me that if I really need to get at this question of explaining Islam, I need to go to Dhaka. But I wanted to draw your attention here to a certain paradox. As I studied this question of Islam in Bengal, I noticed that the majority of the dated mosques were in the western portion of the delta, around here, where the Ganges River enters into the delta region, whereas the majority of the Muslims were in the eastern part. And this would appear to be a puzzle, if not a contradiction. Why are most of the dated mosques in the west, and why is most of the Muslims in the east? This was the fundamental question then that I wanted to explore when I went to Dhaka. So when I got to Dhaka, I also realized that I cannot rely on Persian and Urdu. I need to study Bangla. And so everyone told me, well, if you want to do that, the best place to do that is down in Bordeshal. And I got on the rocket. You see here this famous, which I think is still running even today, between Dhaka down to Bordeshal as far as Joshua. And so I got off the boat at Bordeshal, and here is the building where I studied back in 1982. The formal Oriental Institute run by a French-Canadian priest. It used to be a seminar for training priests. Then it became a language institute. And so I stayed there about 3 or 4 months, studying Bangla every day, many, many hours. And here I am when I went back there in 2016, and here I am in that same building with 3 Bengali friends of mine. 2 of them happen to live in Bordeshal today. So after studying the language, then I began to explore each of the individual districts of Bangladesh with a view to looking for Persian records that might shed some light on the growth of Islamic influence. And it was pointed out to me by the Secretary of Education, the Minister of Education in Dhaka, who earlier had been the DC in Chittagong, that there are many Persian records in the the kachari in the record room of the district collectorates, and he gave me permission to go throughout all of Bangladesh and look at every single record room in every district collectorate of the country. And we made a bargain. I said, okay, I'll go with my camera, and I will make 2 copies of each document that I find. One of them I will keep for myself, and the other I'll give to you. And the Secretary of Education at that time was just beginning to establish the Bangladesh archives, National Archives. And so my records were to be part of that project. So this was a very convenient arrangement that we used. He gave me permission to look at the records, and I gave him some of the actual microfilms of these records. So I went to Badajoz, I went to Jashore District Collectorate, I went to every collectorate in the whole country to look for Persian records. And they were in these, many of them were in these bundles with red tape of the kind that you see in this photograph. And they contain documents such as this one, Persian records dealing with the transfer of land to usually jungle land to pioneers who agreed to build either a temple or a mosque if they would bring the land into cultivation. So these documents record the earliest transformation of jungle land into cultivated rice paddy. And this was a very important process I discovered because it really unlocked the connection between agricultural expansion and the growth of Muslim communities. Attached to these Persian records dealing with settlement were actual images, as you see here, of mosques. On the right, it's written in Bangla. On the left, it's written in Persian. But this word, 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝗃, simply means a straw mosque, a mosque made of thatched bamboo and thatching. Very simple. So we're not talking about grand mosques. We're talking about very simple, crude, ordinary mosques. Here's another one that I found in the Chittagong district record room. And these were all built, thousands of them were built across the countryside as part of this Mughal effort in the 17th and 18th century to settle the land, to expand the area of cultivation. And the mosques themselves looked very much like this, I imagine, because they were built in typical village Bengali style with the curved cornice you see, and the bamboo and thatched materials that were used to make them. Very simple, very common. And this, however, was very important because in contrast to those simple mosques, you had these very stately mosques, like here in the Shakhumbad Mosque in Dhaka, patronized by the Mughals. Or in the countryside, you had more Deshi kind of mosques, like the Atiya Masjid in Mymensingh, whose architecture is very similar to that of contemporary temples throughout Bengal. But these kinds of temples, both the big Mughal mosques like this, or the mosques like the Atiya Masjid, were dated and documented and recorded and they're made of substantial material, brick or stone. And this solved the problem of why this issue of why the Muslims are in the east and the mosques are in the west. The answer is that the mosques that are dated are only those that look like this or that, whereas the simple mosques that were patronized by them in the countryside, these very Deshi kind of thatched mosques, they were not recorded. They're not dated, and they would not appear on the map you see here. Furthermore, I discovered that there was a shift of the rivers in Bengal by examining European maps. In the upper left up here, this Portuguese map by Gastaldi in 1548 shows the Ganga going all the way down here, right by Shotgown, which is not far from Calcutta. This would be the Adi Ganga in the 16th century, the original Ganges. Then in 1615, to the right, you can see how the Ganges is splitting. Half of it goes to Shotgown, and the other half is now going to Dhaka. And then by 1660, the Dutch geographer Van den Broek, you can see how the river now, the Ganges, is moving directly into eastern Bengal, and only a smaller tributary is going down to Shotgown and Calcutta. And then finally, in 1779, under the British, Rennell's famous map, you have a much more definitive, which looks much more like today, where the Ganga goes clear into the eastern portion of Bengal, near Dhaka, and eventually, of course, it joins up with the Brahmaputra, the Jamna River, to form this huge area here. So the point is that the fertility of the Bengal Delta was moving toward the east at the same time that the Mughal political agenda was moving in that direction. That, to me, was a very important clue in understanding the rise of a peasant Muslim population which grew up around these small mosques, which served as the nuclei for new communities. And again, it goes back to this question here. So then, after that book, I was commissioned by Cambridge University Press in about 1994 to write a social history of the Deccan. I did not choose that title. Cambridge History had this big project called the New Cambridge History of India series. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that, where instead of having one volume with each chapter written by a different historian, that was the old Cambridge history going back to the 1920s, edited by Sir Wolseley Haig. Now we're going to have a number of different volumes, each separate volume written by a single historian. And so Cambridge invited me to write a social history of the Deccan. Well, okay, here's the book that as it eventually was published. But this was a very difficult book to write because the Deccan is a very confusing region. In 1995, I got a grant to go to Washington, D.C. and study at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is located in the famous Smithsonian Castle, right on the mall in the middle of Washington. And I spent a year in this tower. You see it on the left over here with the black thing. That was my tower. I spent a whole year right in that little area thinking about the social history of the Deccan. And how am I going to write this book? The Deccan does not have any center, one capital that like the Mughal Empire. There's no single place. There's no one language of the whole Deccan. You have Marathi, you have Kannada, you have Telugu, and politically and linguistically and culturally, it is very diverse. So I'm trying to think, how can I write a social history of the Deccan? Well, it happened that right across from this building at the National Museum of Art in 1996, there was an exhibit of the art of the famous Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer. And so I went across the street. I crossed the mall from the castle to the National Gallery, and I looked at all these paintings. And of course, there was a huge line of people. Vermeer only painted some 25 paintings in his life, and all of them were in this exhibit. It was an extraordinary thing. Probably the first time since his lifetime that all of Vermeer's paintings were collected in one place. So thousands of people were going to this exhibit. And I went to the exhibit myself, and I noticed that people were fascinated by these portraits. Most of all of his work was portraits. He did not do many landscapes. He did portraits of people, ordinary people. You're not looking at kings and queens and nobles. You're looking at ordinary people who were walking down the street, who he brought into a studio and painted. And he captures in these paintings personalities and character that anyone can identify with. And when I went to that museum, I made the immediate connection between art and history, namely that portraiture is to art as biography is to history. In other words, I am going to write a series of biographies in my book, which will be something like what Vermeer was doing in his series of paintings, that each biography will project one social problem or one social issue. And so I went through Deccan history, and here you see the table of contents. 8 people. I chose them so that one person was alive, at least one person was alive at any time between 1289 and 1761. So there was a lot of overlapping. And I had to choose people who represented different regions of the Deccan. Some were Maharashtra, some were Karnataka, some were in Telangana and Andhra. And as you can see from this, each one represents a different thing. 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘓 represents the demise of regional kingdoms. 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘓, the whole relationship between Muslim piety and state authority. With Mahmud Gawan, the conflict between local Muslims who were Deccanese and foreigners who came in from Iran and Central Asia, the so-called Westerners. With Ramaraya, the famous minister of Vijayanagara, I wanted to talk about or discuss elite mobility in the Persianized world. And with Malik Ambar, the whole question of military slavery. Here's an African who was recruited from Ethiopia, one of many thousands of Africans who came to the Deccan and were employed in the military arm of all of the Deccan sultanates. And I wanted to understand that. Tukaram, famous bhakti poet, and of course as a non-Brahmin, and he got into many difficulties with Brahmins, and I wanted to understand the relationship between Brahmins and non-Brahmins, and through the vehicle of bhakti. And Tukaram was I think a very useful choice for that purpose. And Papadou is a great example of a social bandit. I believe you mentioned at the introduction today Hobsbawm. Well, Eric Hobsbawm wrote a great deal about social banditry. So I used Hobsbawm's theory of social bandits and illustrated that by the life of Papadou, who's this kind of extraordinary figure, Robin Hood-like figure, who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor in Telangana. And finally, 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘓, who's this extraordinary woman who fought Aurangzeb in the Mughal Empire, and defeated Aurangzeb's armies repeated times. It was a very important figure in the rise of the Maratha state. But of course, she got in trouble with Brahmins, the Peshwas. And so I wanted to use her life to talk about the rise of Brahmins in politics. And of course, 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘓 was not a Brahmin. She was a very proud Kshatriya woman. And most importantly of all, Cambridge allowed me to use actual pictures of these people when I could find them. Because after all, I'm using biography. I want to use photography as well to capture something of what these people were all about. Here we have 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘓, a statue of her in Kolhapur, Maharashtra. And then Tukaram, the famous bhakti poet, near Dehu, in where he was living. Also, I was allowed to use images of Malik Ambar. You see the black African on the right, extraordinary, powerful, and important man who arrives as a lowly recruit and as a slave, and then becomes himself the vizier, the minister, the regent of the Sultanate of Ahmednagar. And on the left, Mahmud Gawan, the famous madrasa that he patronized, illustrating the kind of very Central Asian architecture of all that. So then I think I'll end today by talking about the very last thing that I did in my encounter with history and with India. The last monograph that I wrote was Power, Memory, and Architecture, Contested Sites on India's Deccan Plateau. And here I co-authored a book with a colleague of mine, Philip Wagner, who is trained not in history, but in architecture and archaeology. And also, I might add, Telugu language. And so he and I spent 2 field seasons looking not at libraries and archives, but going into the field and studying material culture. And this completely changed my whole conception of history, because I was trained, as I'm sure many of you are trained, to think that that history is something that you find in archives or in libraries. Well, that's true, but that's not all the truth. History is also to be found in material culture out in the Mufassal, out in the countryside. And so Phil Wagner and I, we had a driver we found in Hyderabad, and we drove all over the Deccan Plateau, both the northern Deccan and the southern Deccan, exploring hill forts mainly. We wanted to understand several things. And the first question was, how does architecture relate to history? You know, architecture is usually in a different campus, a different part of the campus. It's a different department. And archaeology is in a different department from history. History is over here. Architecture and art is over there. And this is unfortunate, because these are 2 disciplines that really ought to work together. And so when Phil Wagner and I worked together, we wrote as a unit, combining the insights of traditional social history with the insights of archaeology and material culture. So we went to many hill forts. Here is Vijayanagar, here is Daulatabad in Maharashtra, Bidar in Karnataka, Shahpur also in Karnataka. These extraordinary hill forts. Almost every hill in the Deccan has a fort on top of it. Here is El Gandal. And what we studied was, what we found interesting was material culture such as cannons and the introduction of gunpowder in the Deccan. And we were able to trace that by simply looking at things like this Ottoman cannon, which was cast in Turkey and then exported to India. And it comes with this trunnion, which allows the cannon to move up and down, which is a revolutionary idea. This idea was then assimilated by engineers in Bijapur, in fact. And they began to build these huge cannon on the top of all these bastions and on the top of hills. This is the first time anything like this had happened in the world, not just in India. And Yadgir was an area where there was a great deal of experimentation going on with different forms of this new technology, using the swivel cannon and the trunnion technique, which were ideas that had come in from the Portuguese, but now they're being applied to guns that were much larger than in use in Europe itself. For example, on this, here you have a hill, and on top of the hill is a round circular area where a huge cannon is established. It's all cast out of wrought iron. And the cannon itself is located on a big block you see here, and the block moves around on an iron peg. This is very crude, it's very simple, but it's a revolutionary idea in terms of technology. So I myself went down and I made this photograph you're looking at on the lower left here. You have a mounting block, and then you have the top surface of the platform, and in between you have an iron peg, so that the whole cannon is able to move 360 degrees around. Nowhere in the world had this ever been done before. This cannon right here is a very important artifact in world history, precisely because it documents this revolutionary technology. So I went down there myself, and here I am underneath this block with my camera, and I'm photographing this earlier picture here you're seeing in the lower left to understand how they made this thing work. Of course, within only 10 or 15 years, they were moving from wrought iron to cast bronze with much more sophisticated cannons, which involved in turn building large structures like this 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘊𝘴, where you would climb up about 50 or 60 steps. At the very top, they had these cannons that would command the entire countryside, swiveling around 360 degrees. So this kind of technology is the thing that we were interested in, is how new technology, new gunpowder technology drove different kinds of architecture. In this case, the building of forts themselves. Here you can see the 15th century wall to the right, the 16th century cannon to the left. Up in the very top here, you see a 𝗏𝘊𝘃𝘊𝘴, and that's where the cannon would poke out of. This cannon you see here, located inside the 𝗏𝘊𝘃𝘊𝘴. All of this is happening in Bijapur, whereas in Vijayanagar, its enemy to the south, none of that is happening. The walls of Vijayanagar do not have mortar. They do not accommodate cannon. They were simply inadequate for defense. And so the point I'm making here is that our study was really focused on material culture, but it tried to show how material culture can explain social culture and political culture as well. And then finally, and I know we're getting out of time, so I just want to conclude with the most recent book that just came out last summer. I was asked by Penguin in England, in London, to write a connected history of all of India between 1000 to 1765. This was the biggest challenge of my lifetime. But in a way, it allows me to come full circle back to my very earliest study of India, indeed my very earliest life, which is the encounter with Persian and India. Basically, in this book, I decided that we needed to move away from the conventional way of looking at Indian history through the lens of religion. People like P.N. Oak, who you see here in the lower left, made outrageous statements such as the Red Fort is a Hindu building, or the Taj Mahal is a temple palace. And it occurred to me that what is happening in recent decades in India is a unfortunate tendency to read religion into everything. And even though my own career has focused on the study of Islam and the rise of Islam and why Muslims are more prominent in some parts of India than others, I came to realize that we need to study Indian history on a different way of approach. Recently, or 2014, Prime Minister Modi gave this speech where he referred to much of Indian history in terms of slavery. 1200 saal ki gulami, 1200 years of servitude. And I think that's a mischaracterization, but I find most interesting about his comment, if you read the actual 28 words that you find here in Hindi, 7 of them are Persian. So it's very ironic that the very period of time, the 1200 years that he is dismissing as servitude or slavery, is the same period that Persian language itself and Persian vocabulary was infiltrating India. And that is the reason why I decided to entitle my book India in the Persianate Age. What I wanted to do was to study how Persian language and literature related to Sanskrit language and literature. And it happens that a colleague of mine, 𝗏𝘶𝘊𝘆, wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Language of the Gods in the World of Men. And it's about Sanskrit and the diffusion of Sanskrit culture from Eastern Afghanistan all the way through Southeast Asia. How Sanskrit language and Sanskrit literature established a body of norms focused on moral order as well as social order. And that really, between the 4th and the 14th century, was a very important phenomenon. It occurred to me that the same thing could be said about the Persian world, that there was the Persian language and Persian literature had a similar career in establishing a language that was used not only in terms of moral order and social order through literature, a canon of literature that was studied across this extraordinary area from the Balkans to Burma, but also the language of ordinary administration. The Mughals used Persian, and most importantly, the central insight of my book, and I'm going to close on this point now, is that India is the area where these two worlds overlapped. You have an earlier Sanskrit world, which is a trans-regional culture. Sanskrit traveled through enormous range of territory, all the way from Afghanistan to Singapore. And Persian, which also is a trans-regional language, unlike languages that are local or regional. And it seemed to me the way to think about, one way to think about Indian history before the British is the long story of interaction between these two cultures, which occurs in a wide variety of ways, very complex ways. So I think I'm going to stop there. We have been going on for almost an hour. And I hope that I have addressed the question of how I became not only an historian, but why and how I became an historian of India in particular. It's a fascination that, of course, has no ending. I will continue to work, and I will come back to India, and certainly to Calcutta, a city that I really love, and I have many fond memories of your city. So with that, I'm going to close, and I would invite any questions from anyone who would like to raise them or comments you may have. Thank you very much.
All right. So that was a wonderful lecture by Professor Richard Eaton. And your PowerPoint presentation, sir, it was amazing. And I think our audience, your anecdotes, they have inspired our audience, but mostly they have inspired us, the students of history. And we are immensely grateful for that. Thank you, sir. So now moving on to the questions. Can we have the questions? Okay. So this is from Hasnian Aziz. It is an honor to ask you this question. I want to ask that why Bangladesh became Muslim majority despite being far away from Delhi. Is this because Bengal was the richest province of the subcontinent under Mughals?
Well, thank you for the question. That actually was precisely the question that I began my research in when I wrote my book, The Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier. I too wanted to know why is it that the largest concentration of Muslims in South Asia are not in the area of Delhi, but either to the west in Punjab or to the east in Bengal. And to answer that question, that's the reason that I went to Bengal. That's why I went to Calcutta and then to Dhaka. And the answer to the question was essentially that that in Bengal, unlike other parts of India, Islam was identified and associated with agriculture, and especially with rice cultivation. And I wanted to know, why is that the case? Because that's not true in other parts of India. So when I discovered those documents that I showed you about the settlement of jungle land by pioneers, that's when I realized that these pioneers, although they were there for the purpose of transforming jungle into rice paddy, they were required by the Mughal government to build either a temple or a mosque. The Mughals didn't care, but they wanted to have some kind of stability. Remember, the Mughals, they didn't care about religion. They wanted stability, loyalty, and revenue. Those are the three things they wanted. And so they thought that by having either a temple or a mosque built in this jungle area, that would provide a focus of stability. It just happened that most of these pioneers were Muslims, and therefore the building that they were constructed was a mosque, a very simple mosque, a very crude mosque. And that became the focal point of these indigenous communities who were not already Hindu. It's a very important point that Hinduism itself had not yet penetrated deeply into Eastern Bengal by the 16th century. So these pioneers were very important figures. They were not missionaries. They were not trying to convert anyone. They were required to build a mosque. But what's interesting, over time, these same pioneers became remembered as having saints, as having been pious saints. And some of them were even given biographies that connected them to the Middle East, to Central Asia, or even to Arabia. So my point is that Islam is part of a larger process. It's not isolated. It's part of a process of ecological change, of social change, and of political change. That the Mughal Empire was moving into Eastern Bengal. The Western was already settled. When the Mughal Empire comes to Bengal, Western Bengal is already under cultivation. It's already largely Hindu by this time, and the caste system is well developed in that area. Eastern Bengal is very different. So the rise of the pioneers coming in and building these mosques had a transformative impact on not only the land but also the people. The people were transformed from being fishermen or hunters or shifting cultivators practicing jhum cultivation. Now they're going to be doing permanent rice cultivation. So it was a major change for them. And that change was associated with the pioneer that had initiated that transformation, namely these people who went in and were given land. And those documents of land transfer were the very documents that I was able to locate in the district record rooms throughout Bangladesh. So that's a long answer, but I just want to emphasize that this has nothing to do with power, with the Delhi, or with armies, or with conquest. It has to do with agricultural change. And that, to me, is the important part. So, thank you.
All right. From Ali Nadim Rizavi sir, what made you focus on the Deccan states, though your earlier trips had exposed you mostly to North India? Was it their Iranian nobility and connect to Iranian culture, where you had spent a lot of time?
Yes, thank you for that question. Why the Deccan? Well, it happened that when I was at the University of Wisconsin, I had two professors. One of them was Robert Frickenberg, who was born in Guntur district, Andhra. and he was raised in Eastern Deccan, and so he already knew a lot about the Deccan, and used to talk about his days growing up in Guntur district. But he, of course, specialized in modern India. The more important figure for me was another historian who came to Wisconsin and was also my teacher. This was John Richards. I'm sure many of you know his name. John Richards is the author of several important books. His first book was on Golconda, under the Mughals. He had studied in the Deccan. He lived in Hyderabad for 1 year and did research on Mughal records there. So I had my both of my professors were themselves had close connection with the Deccan. And I think it was Professor Frickenberg who suggested that I look at Bijapur. Although it could have been John Richards, I'm not certain. Anyway, one of them suggested that I look at Bijapur. And when I found that one Persian chronicle, it was called the 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 Bijapur, the Garden of the Saints of Bijapur. That one manuscript led me to Hyderabad and hence studying the Deccan. So the reason I studied the Deccan really had to do with my own teachers who had both worked in the Deccan and had studied that area. Thank you.
This is from Rakesh De. I have a question which is not related with today's lecture, but I have this question that while studying your book, India in the Persianate Age, okay, he's asking that the attack by Sultan Mahmud on the Somnath temple, whether it had any effect on the political sphere of contemporary time.
Thank you for the question. That very question really has already been answered by probably the most well-known historian living today, which is Romola Tupper. She has a book on Somnath. I can't remember the exact title, but it's Somnatha, something like Many Histories. And she already explored that question of Mahmud and his invasion. And she is the one who alerted me to the fact that immediately after Mahmud's invasion and sacking of Somnath, we do not have any Sanskrit records describing that invasion. And that's rather alarming. It's rather surprising. You would think that people of that time would have recorded it or referred to it in some way or another. But what reality is that that temple had been attacked many times by Indian kings before and after Sultan Mahmud. And so the attack by Sultan Mahmud was not really unusual. It was only one of many attacks that had occurred over the ages. And the real question is, why and how did Sultan Mahmud become such an enormous figure in the memory of that event? And I think that has much to do with the early 19th century, when the British were defeated in Afghanistan in the first Afghan War, and they needed to show Indians that they were strong. And so they made up this story that Sultan Mahmud, when he sacked the temple of Somnath in 1026, that he had taken the gates of Somnath with him back to Afghanistan. That would have been in the early 11th century. And now the British in the early 19th century are claiming to have found those gates of Somnath and then returned them back to India. This was a purely political move designed to endear the Hindus of India to the British. The whole thing was absolutely made up. It did not happen. Sultan Mahmud never took the gates of Somnath with him to Afghanistan. Any art historian can immediately see those gates and understand they're not Indian, they're Afghan. So to answer your question, the real fascinating, well, to me, the interesting question is why and how did Sultan Mahmud become such an enormously outsized figure in memory today? And that, I think, has to do with the East India Company and the need by the British to restore their own reputation and to be seen as kind of larger than life figures who are restoring these gates of Somnath to the Indian population. That, of course, immediately meant that Sultan Mahmud became a demon. He became an enemy. And the British would be understood as the heroes for having returned those gates. So it's a long, complicated story, but it's one that I think has already been well treated by Professor Romila Tupper. If you have not read her book, I encourage you to see her book. I think it's called Somanata, The Many Narratives of History, or something like that. Anyway, read that book. It's a good book.
All right. The next one. By Nana Ganguly. Is there still a divide between urban Sufis and rustic mystical Sufis, like the ones who had their khankas on Shahpur Hillock in the 16th, 17th centuries?
Well, the question is, there's still a divide. And if you're talking about today, I would have to say no, simply because today, obviously, the Bijapur is no longer a sovereign sultanate, or you have a sultan ruling in the city. Bijapur is simply one more district center in Karnataka. And so you do not have a political divide between, the sultan, the ruler, living in the citadel of Bijapur and the surrounding countryside. Whereas in the 16th and 17th century, you did have that. You had a very stark difference between the central core of the city, which was the citadel, and the court of the sultan. And since it was a center of power, urban Sufis sought the patronage of the sultans in the city, whereas those living outside, like in Shahpur Hillock, they conform to an earlier tradition of trying to distance themselves from the court. Some orders, like the Chishti, felt that it is not right to consort with political power, that they should be focused on God, not on kings. And so, starting with 𝗏𝘓𝘃𝘓 in Gulbarga, he moved his khanga away from the center of Bahmani power in Gulbarga, outside the city, so he could distance himself from power. And it seems to me that in Bijapur, the same thing happened. The Chishti Sufis were making a statement that they did not want to be associated with the sultans. They wanted to be associated with the people. And that was something that happened then. But today, of course, that distinction is no longer there, simply because the power dynamics have changed. We no longer find in Bijapur today, a sultan who's sitting in the court as a center of power. So that's the major change that I would see. Thank you.
This is from Shomita Roy. Sir, do you think that only Persian records are enough to understand the process of conversion in Bengal, where a majority of Muslim population speak and read and understand Bengali?
Oh, that's a very simple question to answer. Persian records by no means are sufficient. You need everything you can find. Uh, in order to solve complicated questions like the one that I was trying to understand, you need to explore Portuguese records because the Portuguese were very active in this area. You need to study Jesuit records because Rome had been sending missionaries into the area. But most importantly, you have to look at the Bengali materials that are contemporary with this period of time. And so you have, an enormous range of literature which is being composed at the same time that these Persian records and documents are being produced. You have, for example, Mukundaram, the famous writer of the 16th century, early 17th century, whose own work is useful for understanding the social environment and the political environment and the religious environment of his day. In a sense, that kind of literature represents a snapshot of the countryside at the time. And then you have other literature that is actually polemical in nature. I'm thinking of works by Muslim writers of the 17th century, like Syed Sultan, who has a huge book called the 𝗏𝗶𝘀𝘁𝘆, which is a study of the history of the prophets, the family of the prophets, literally, where he connects Indian deities like Shiva and Rama with the prophets of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, so that the Prophet Muhammad is seen as only one in a succession of different prophets over time, connecting the advent of Islam with earlier times. So, yes, your question is very well stated. Persian records are by no means sufficient by themselves to understand this complex process of conversion. We need all literature we can find, everything we can get our hands on that will help us understand this problem. And that is what my book tried to do. By the way, I might add, I think I mentioned this yesterday, that the rise of Islam in the Bengal frontier will be coming out in a Bangla translation next month in Dhaka. The University Press Limited is going to bring that out. So anyway, thank you for that question. Very good question.
Okay, there's another one by Nanak Ganguly. Professor Eaton, okay. For the population, veneration of the Sufis and more importantly their tombs has led to the rise of countless popular stories about them that, with the compilation of these biographies passed from oral to written traditions, considering factors like time lag between the life of Sufi and the date of compilation of his biography, led to the confirmation of certain archetypes of Indo-Muslim saints. Another type is the discourse Malfuzat. Okay, so how much we can depend on them considering the time lag. Take for example 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 Bijapur in Persian by 19th century historian Muhammad Ibrahim Zubaydi. That's a big question.
That's a very good question, and I thank you for asking that question, because what you're really raising here is the issue of how important it is that we always try to find texts that are contemporary with the period we're writing about. If you're writing about the 16th century, you need to find sources that are contemporary with the 16th century and not the 19th or 20th century. You are quite right. The 𝘓𝘪𝘧𝘦 Bijapur was compiled in the 19th century, even though it talks about period going all the way back to the 13th century. And what I would say is this: that text referred to earlier chronicles. Even though it was compiled in the 19th century, it was based on earlier records that went back to the 17th and 16th and even 15th centuries. And so I discovered very quickly that the 𝘓𝘳𝑦𝘃 was not itself sufficient to tell my story. I had to go back to the records that the 𝘓𝘳𝑦𝘃 itself referred to, which was a very long process. But I also want to say one thing else here, and it's why I like your question. One of the chapters I wrote in my book, Sufis of Bijapur, chapter 2, talks about a category of Sufi known as warrior Sufis. And I made a big mistake in that chapter. I was using materials that were much later than the 13th or 14th century, even though I was referring to the 14th century. I was using materials that were written in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I now believe that I believe that that was a mistake. And I realized that, especially when I looked at Bengal. I came to Bengal and I found again evidence of warrior Sufis claimed to have having lived in the 14th century. But the records were much later. And the records that were claiming them to be warriors were actually composed in the 17th century in Bengal. Specifically, I'm talking about Shah Jalal in Sylhet, the famous saint of Eastern Bengal, whom Ibn Battuta had met in the 14th century. Well, if you look at 17th century records, he is constructed as having been a warrior saint. And there is no such evidence of that kind of activity if you look at the 14th century records. When I saw that, I realized that my chapter 2 in the Bijapur book was mistaken, that I had made the historian's error of using 17th century records to describe a 14th century phenomenon in the Bijapur book. So in other words, I'm saying that when you write history, it is always possible to make mistakes, and you need to learn from your mistakes. It's only when I studied Shah Jalal in working my Bengal book that I realized my mistake of the Bijapur book. So I want to thank you very much for raising that question. It speaks directly to the importance of always using contemporary records whenever possible. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay. Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay asks, okay, many Sufi saints were formerly Ghazi or soldier who converted many local people forcefully to Islam, especially in terms of Bengal. Again, in later life, they were becoming very mystic Sufi saints, and they were followed as great saints by all the people. So what made these conversions? What led to such conversion? Is it what he's trying to mean?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Well, I think that the whole question of Ghazi is a red herring. In other words, it takes us down a track which is not sustained by contemporary evidence. That I do not believe there was such thing as a Ghazi Sufi. These Ghazi Sufis were constructed later on. In other words, in the 17th century, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, in the 17th century, biographies of Sufi lives were interested in constructing the idea of the warrior Sufi or the Ghazi Sufi. And they made up this idea of Ghazis who had lived in the earlier period, when in point of fact, they were not real. There's no evidence that there were ever any such things as Ghazi Sufis. I think the idea of a warrior Sufi is not found in contemporary evidence, but it is found in later evidence in the 17th century. So the interesting question that one needs to raise is what was happening in the 17th century that made it likely that biographers would even try to construct this warrior image on these earlier saints. And that is a question of historiography, not of history. I might add that the same question has been raised in Ottoman history. When you read Ottoman history, there was an earlier generation of Ottoman historians going all the way back to the 19th century. I'm thinking of people like Paul Vitek, who creates this idea of the Ghazi saint. And his thesis was that the Ottoman Empire, beginning with Osman himself, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, 13th century, his thesis was that Osman was a Ghazi, was a jihad warrior, and he based that judgment on subsequent constructions of Osman as Osman Ghazi. But contemporary records do not use the word Ghazi. And therefore, it seems to me that, again, we need to talk about why is it that later generations are projecting backwards this conception of a Ghazi or warrior. And we now know in Ottoman history that was a false construction. And it seems to me that we have the same problem when looking at India. So, thank you.
Ali Haider, do you think Sikhism and Allah Upanishad are best examples of intermingling of Persianate and Sanskrit world? Or do you think that there are other best examples also?
Well, I would not. Yes, thank you for that question too. No, I don't think that's the best one. I'm not sure there is a best one. I think you have so many examples of the intermingling of the Persian and the Sanskrit. It's really hard to make a choice. Sikhism itself is permeated with Persian vocabulary. I mean, even the very word khalsa is an Arabic word, which has come through Persian. And you have many terms and indeed Muslim saints that appear in the Adi Granth of the Sikhs. So I would not say that there is any single best example. There are many examples from different areas of life. You could talk about architecture. You could talk about art. We could talk about music. I didn't talk about music in my book very much. I wish I had. I think I need to do another book on this topic of music and cuisine. Think of the food. Think of the words that you use that come into Bengali and into Hindi and Urdu that are Persian and have to do with clothing, with the food we eat, the drinks we have. I'm thinking of things like faluda and 𝗟𝗏 and all these things that we have, a pure Persian. In music, it's impossible to imagine Indian music today without recognizing the enormous influence of Persian instruments. I mean, the word tabla is Persian. Tar, sitar, guitar, it's all Persian. I'm simply going to plead that it's not possible to say there is a single best example. You have thousands of examples, whether we're talking about architecture, religion, art, warfare, technologies, things are transferring back and forth all the time. Clothing and food and music, I just mentioned. And the whole spectrum of culture is so interwoven between Persianate and Sanskrit that one can go on with an infinite number of examples. And my book is only, I think, suggesting a few that I hope other people will find more. I hope the idea of looking at Persianate and Sanskrit interaction is something that other people will take up. because my book is by no means the last word. It's not even the first word, but it seems to me that I would hope to see other scholars look for other examples of how the Persian and the Sanskrit worlds were interrelated and always have been. So thank you for that question.
I'm sorry, sir. I didn't switch on the mic. I'm sorry. So Debojyoti Mondal asks how one can define the contribution of the Sufis in the field of the religious syncretism in Bengal.
Right. Well, that's a very complicated question because you use the word syncretism, and I don't like that word. I think that syncretism is an unfortunate term because it presupposes two separate entities that are now mixed together. And I think a more accurate word is adaptation rather than syncretism. And by adaptation, what I mean here is that different societies and cultures will creatively adapt elements from outside and make it their own. And this is something which has many forces and factors behind it, only one of which is the Sufis. But to answer your question, yes, when a writer like Syed Sultan is trying to use when he's talking about Islam and Islamic theology and theological ideas, he is framing them through the universe of Bengali language and Bengali imagery, Bengali aesthetics, Bengali sensibility, so that in a sense, Islam becomes Bengalified, if you will, or made acceptable to Bengali culture. And that raises the real question, is there really any conversion happening if people are simply, if the whole thing is being assimilated into Bengali, the Bengali universe? There's a wonderful book which is coming out this year by a young woman, scholar, Irani is her name. It's about the 𝗏𝘶𝘃𝘁 itself, and is a fascinating exploration of Syed Sultan's 𝗏𝘶𝘃𝘁 as which addresses this theme of syncretism that you're mentioning here. I cannot give you I tell you what, I can email to you, Sharanya, the title of that book after we finish talking, and you can give it to your colleagues, friends. Sure.
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
Sure, sir.
Great.
Okay. Ali Nadeem Rizavi sir asks another question. Please also mention how you took upon yourself to write about temple destruction in pre-modern times.
On December 6, 1992, a mob of Hindu activists destroyed the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. And immediately, apologists for that destruction used the historical argument that it's okay to destroy, it's only one mosque. After all, Hindus have been destroying temples, hundreds of temples, thousands of temples for many hundreds of years. And so that event, the Babri Masjid event, since it was justified on historical grounds, with people making all kinds of wild claims about thousands of temples having been destroyed by Muslims, I decided somebody needs to look at this question and understand, what is the evidence? What is the evidence? And since nobody had done this, I decided that I would do it. So when I was in that Smithsonian Tower that I showed you earlier, in Washington, D.C., that castle up in my tower. Before I encountered Vermeer and the social history of the Deccan, I decided I'm going to study the issue of temples. So I gathered together all evidence I could of contemporary, again, contemporary. That's the key point. You want inscriptions that are written at the time. You want chronicles that are written at the time. And I made the best attempt I could to gather all the information that it is available, almost all of it in Persian, about the desecration of temples. And I was looking for patterns. I want to know, is there a pattern here, or is it simply random? And the pattern was obvious. The temples that were destroyed were always those temples that were associated with an enemy political power that lay in the pathway of a moving military frontier. That once an area was consolidated and peaceful, all the temples were left alone. And so it was obvious to me that this is primarily a political issue, and therefore we need to understand and coordinate the geography with chronology. So you need maps. You need to see how the desecration of temples took place over time as the Delhi Sultanate was expanding, or as Hindu patrons who had formerly accepted Muslim rule rebelled against that rule. And when there was rebellion, not only was the rebel liable for punishment, usually by being executed, but also the temples that he patronized were also liable for punishment. So again, whether it's the initial expansion of Muslim power or whether it's the rebellion against it, the issue of temple desecration seems to have been associated in every case with a political issue. Normal temples were always left alone. Village temples were never touched. Or classical temples that were used to be important, but which are no longer used or no longer associated with political power, they were left alone. Khajuraho, for example, in the Gangetic Plain was never touched. The great temples of South India, associated with the Kakatiya dynasty, once the dynasty no longer patronized them, the temple had no political use or purpose or interest, and therefore it was simply ignored. So my interest in temple desecration came about because of the destruction of the Babri Masjid, and I simply wanted to know, what is the historical background to this? Is there an historical case to be made for desecrating a mosque based on earlier Indian history? That was why I did it.
Okay, so I think this was the last question. So that's it. Okay, so thank you, sir. A big thank you from the team. And
Wow.
I mean, we hope to hear more from you in future. And do visit India, do visit Calcutta.
I will. Yes.
Yes, please. Yes, please
Absolutely
do.
will. Yes. No, I will definitely be coming. I do know when. We have to get past all this COVID-19 has to get past us.
Yes.
But I will come. And when I come,
Yes.
we will definitely have a meeting. Face to face.
Sure, sir. Sure. Of course, sir. That will be an honor. Okay, so stay safe, and
right.
And to our audience, keep supporting us, and we promise to come up with more such webinars and lectures. Good night.